This is Chapter 2, Managing Within an Organization. So let's start by defining what an organization is. It's a systematic arrangement of people to accomplish a specific purpose. And you need the following for it to work: people, structure, and a purpose. So we're going to go over all of these in this lecture today. An organization, it can be a very obviously broad term, but I'm going to try to keep bringing it back to a food service operation in my examples. So management is part of this, right? This is where the people come into play. So management is involved in planning, organizing, leading, and controlling the use of the different resources available to achieve the objectives. So in food service, your objective would be to provide meals to your customers or clients. So the management side, or the managers, are those who essentially oversee and direct the work of others. And the workers are the people who do the work of the organization to produce the product. Now, that's not to say that the managers could not be involved or should not be involved in actually producing the product, but that's technically they're the ones that just oversee that work happening. So let's talk a little bit about a structure of the organization. It's based on these 5 elements. We're going to talk about these in subsequent slides. So we have hierarchy, your span of control, the different types of relationships between line and staff. An organization can be centralized or decentralized. We'll talk more about what that means. And then it's departmentalization. So let's start with hierarchy. This is essentially the reporting relationships in an organization. And you may know this as chain of command, which is essentially related to the level of authority and power. Line managers are typically the managers who have reporting relationships up and down. So these might be what you consider middle managers. So they have managers who they report to above them, and they also have employees that report to them. And I'll show you some different levels on the next slide as an example. So in this is figure 2.1 from your textbook. You have your CEO or your Chief Executive Officer, and then all the subsequent managers that report to that individual. So you see at the very bottom, those are your food service workers, or your essential ones that get everything done, and they report to all of the individuals above them. Typically, their direct line is their food service supervisor, right? If they have issues, or if they're going to be late, or if they're going to be out for the day, they don't directly call the CEO to let them know that. They call their direct line food service supervisor, their direct line manager. So every other supervisor in this chain of command has somebody that they report to as well. So managers oversee and direct the work, and you do see you have obviously different levels: top level, middle managers, and then frontline. Frontline are usually the ones that direct and supervisors who supervise the workers who actually produce the product. And a lot of times these individuals have worked their way up. So they may be managing people who are now they're managing, but they maybe at one time were their coworker or their peer. A lot of times in food service, individuals work their way up into management, so they understand what it takes to do the job because they had done the job at one point in time. So they are often working managers, and they have that area of expertise. They know what it takes to do the job, and a lot of times these are very effective managers because of that. Let's talk a little bit about span of control in management. This is really one of the measures of influence of a manager, and it's measured by the number of individuals who report directly to that manager. So it's how many people can you oversee. And in recent years, the trend is for managers to have a large span of control, meaning they have a lot of individuals who report to them, that there's not necessarily a large hierarchy that ends up being more flat. So you have one individual who maybe oversees 10 to 15 to 20 people, which really can be challenging depending on policies that are in place, and we'll talk more about that. And this is common now really just to help with cost. I think a lot of organizations are doing that, called downsizing or right sizing. So they're not necessarily hiring as many management positions as workers to actually get that work done. Organizations can be centralized or decentralized. So what does that mean? Well, centralization is the concentration of all the decisions that are made at the upper levels of the organization. So your CEOs, your directors, they're really the ones making the decisions that are executed by the frontline workers. Whereas decentralization is the ability for individuals at lower levels of the organization, so those frontline workers, to make decisions appropriate to their area of responsibility. So it gives them the flexibility and the ability to change the way something's done. Maybe because once you're in it, you see, oh, there's a little bit better way to do this, or a way to be a little bit more efficient with my time. So decentralization allows for that to happen organically. It doesn't require you to request from upper management if you can go ahead and implement that new strategy or that new way of doing something. Departmentalization is very common in organizations, and it's a specialization of groups within an organization. So think of like an accounting department or a billing department. It's usually based on a product or a function or a process. So it's helpful in a lot of organizations to have this type of organization, because it provides especially for management, you have an expert or expertise in that specific area of departmentalization. So whether or not it's an accountant, so you would want to hire somebody who has that expertise in accountancy to oversee that department. Some problems potentially, it's really communication, lack of coordination between groups. So in food service, I've seen it in ordering versus receiving. Ordering too much item, not being aware of what's actual space is in a freezer or a storage area. They know that they needed the product, but they didn't coordinate or communicate with the warehouse to determine, is there enough space for this product that we're ordering? Is there a specific day that's better to receive such product? They're really good at ordering the product, but they don't necessarily have the expertise in knowing what is a requirement or what's needed in the warehouse. So that could be a potential issue, but honestly, it's just a lack of communication between the different departments within that organization. Organization charts, I'm sure you're familiar with. It's just a graphic representation of an organization's structure. It typically illustrates the relationship of the hierarchy, who reports to who. And it does show you the different levels, and it shows you if there's a specific type of departmentalization in that organization, as well as that span of control. So who reports to who and how many of those individuals report to that higher level manager. And sometimes, depending on the organization, they can be very complex, those organization charts. So sometimes it takes a couple different charts to illustrate the structure. And there might be different graphics to show within a department. They may have their own org chart comparative to an org chart within the actual large organization. So it depends on the business itself and how large that will be. So here's an example of what one looks like. You can find it in your textbook, figure 2.5, but it shows you the director of nutrition and dietetics and then all of those subsequent managers, who reports to them and who they oversee. I'm sure you probably have seen something like this in the past in your own work experience. So this is fairly common in most, or really any type of organization. What things aren't clear or maybe not apparent from looking at that chart is the non-vertical work or other things that are outside the scope of those overseeing those specific employees by the manager. This could include committee work and maybe special projects and networking and that communication piece and knowing who is the manager in a different department who you can work with, trying to get things accomplished. Centralization of decision making and who that falls to, depending on if you're centralized or decentralized. And then the division of labor. So who does what specific task? If you know you got to have these cakes made for tray line, who actually does that specific task of making the cakes? It's not delineated in that org chart, right? That's more in your job description. All organizations have, or they should have, written mission and visions. And why is that? Well, it helps really for the organization to determine why they exist and what their focus should be. And their purpose should be written and accessible to everybody, whether you are an employee or you're a client or customer. So here's an example of a mission that was written by an RD in the Phoenix School District. And they wrote, "We think about food because they can't think without it." So obviously a well thought out mission, and you know that they're all about serving their students, because we know if we don't have full bellies, we can't learn. And so this is a great purpose. So a mission statement's usually your philosophy or purpose that drives the organization. So here's ASU's Department of Nutrition. Our mission statement is to provide students with comprehensive, rigorous academic core of knowledge and professional skills to ensure future success in their chosen endeavors. So you'll find pretty much all organizations have some sort of mission and vision, whether or not they write it down or it's on your wall or if it's in a yearly meeting, but typically they will be there. Along with that, an organization has a culture, and a culture can be described as a personality of an organization. So lots of things can affect or influence that culture, like your basic assumptions and the size of the organization, how much teamwork takes place, risk-taking behavior, and this is not, poor risk-taking, such as doing things unethically, but risk-taking is taking a chance and maybe doing something a little bit differently outside of the norm that may increase efficiency or increase productivity, instead of always doing things the same way over and over and over again, right? Trying to do something new, being innovative. That's more what we think about when we talk about risk-taking behavior. Centralization of decision-making and leadership styles, things like that. And so every organization will have a little bit different take on these, and thus it will influence their culture. So when we talk about culture, usually it revolves and is influenced and affects the way managers manage, and managers will need all these different types of skills to be effective managers, technical, human, and conceptual different skills. And sometimes you may have found you've worked with managers that have one and not another. One that really knows all the technicality of the job and knows exactly what needs to be done, but cannot deal with human interaction very well. Like, they are not a people person. They do not deal well with conflict. Which makes them a difficult manager to work for sometimes, because unfortunately in management, you sometimes do have to deal with conflict and employee issues. And so if you don't have that skill, it can be problematic for your employees. And then conceptual skills, that's where do you as your department fall in line, and how do you affect other departments? So example here would be if I am the manager of a food service department and I make a change in a hospital, say it's in a hospital location, how does that impact housekeeping? How does that impact the nurses on the different floors, if at all? So it's being aware of what your change will have on other departments within your organization. Management functions. So they have a lot of different functions, and again, some managers are better at this than others. Some of these you just have innately, and some you learn as you grow as a manager. So they plan, they organize, they lead, and also control. We'll go more into these in the next slides. So planning is definitely a function of management, and the goal is hopefully to keep in mind the mission and setting goals to outline the steps necessary to meet those goals. So you have, depends on the amount of time that you have to get these plans in place, whether it's short term or long term, next week or in the next 5 years. And management should be involved in strategic planning. Where do they want to be in the next 10 years? How do they see growth? It's all, overall big picture kind of planning. Organizing is management function as well, which deals with establishing an orderly, systematic method of dealing with work. So organizing staffing, processes, schedules, policies and procedures, which are also known as PMPs. We'll talk more about that in the next slide. Some managers are really good at this, knowing what staff is needed to get things done, what type of equipment, if there's a new food item that they have on the menu, do they need a new piece of equipment in order to make that food item? This is usually one that's effective, or managers are really good at if they've been in those lower level on the boots, or on ground, boots on the ground type of positions. Like, they've done the work, they know what it takes to be done, so they can then organize and be able to make sure that they have everything in place in order for that meal to happen. So they're also involved, obviously, like we mentioned before, in the policies and procedures. And what is that? It's essentially a policy statement, how something's going to be handled, the purpose of it, who it affects, that's the scope, and then what needs to be done. These are very helpful for managers to have in place. So if an issue were to occur, they know in essence how to react. This also helps with span of control. So you don't have to be everywhere at every place in order to help maybe a lower level manager or an employee deal with a certain situation, because you have a policy in place. So let me give you an example. If I have a student who comes through the lunch line, this is maybe an elementary student, and mom and dad forgot to send lunch money with them to school that day. They come through with their tray. The cashier rings them up and finds that they don't have any money on their account. There should be a policy and procedure in place on how that worker needs to handle that situation. So they don't have to stop the line, go track down a manager and ask, what do I need to do? Right? There's a policy and procedure that's been trained and in place, and that cashier knows how to handle that student's situation. Whether that's allowing the student to continue through with that meal, whether it's providing that student a cheese sandwich and allowing them to go through a salad bar, whatever it happens to be for that school district. But there's some sort of procedure in place. Those are lifesavers for managers, and it creates organization and really creates a sense of relief for employees because they know what to do in those situations. So here's an example of a policy and procedure for hand washing. Gives you the policy, the purpose, who it affects, and then the actual procedure to follow. This is pretty straightforward example, but it gives you an idea of kind of what they look like. Other management functions, as mentioned, was leadership or leading. I'm not going to get into a lot of this because we're going to cover this quite a bit in the next module in Chapter 3. There's a whole section on leadership, and this is definitely a skill and something that people, I think, get better at the more and the longer that they're managers. And leadership is one of those things that you just, it's hard to read it in a book and then just innately have leadership. It's And one of those you a lot of times actually have to experience, be put in situations, and have some understanding of how really people work, what their motivation is, and knowing where they're coming from is a lot, to me at least, of what leadership is about. Controlling was mentioned, and this is a management function which involves looking at the work that's done and ensuring that standards are met. So this is probably what a lot of people think about for management and what they do. Like, they're coming around to check my work, right? They inspect what they expect. Well, yes and no. And in food service, a lot of times this comes in the sense of maybe checking food temperatures and making sure that they're meeting food safety standards, or that things aren't burnt, or that, the vegetables aren't overcooked. I'm sure if you've ever overcooked broccoli, right, you know that it's no longer that bright, vibrant green. It looks very sad and sometimes even like almost gray or brown. As a manager, if you were to see that, you would then want to have some sort of corrective action put into place, right? So this is what we mean by controlling. They're overseeing maybe production and seeing what is being produced and making sure that you're meeting the required standards. Other management roles, there are 3 different types, and they have subsequent definitions underneath these, but interpersonal, informational, and decisional. Interpersonal is working with others. Again, like I mentioned before, sometimes you have managers who are fantastic at this, right? They work really well. They've got great people skills. Some other managers, and maybe this is where they're lacking, they don't necessarily work well with others or have fantastic people skills. Informational, this is usually the part of disseminating information and getting communications out. And then decisional, making choices that impact the work and work environment. And we'll cover that more in Chapter 4 moving forward.